All right, so clearly two very different visions of where we have to go, and I think in both cases they leave room for the other side to play a role, but what we're talking about here is emphasis and focus and so on. So I am going to pose some questions, and then I am going to step back and let the debaters do what they do, which is debate. I'm going to start with you, Mike. Chris talked about the role of Indigenous people in the energy economy. Further go big construction of the energy system will involve clearly traditional territories of Indigenous people, whether it's pipelines or oil extractions or transmission lines or dams. How does that scenario that your side laid out account for the need to ensure fundamental rights are respected and Indigenous people are full partners in economic development? And how, on the other hand, might the go-home scenario really just leave Indigenous people as minority players in these projects?
Well, Sean, let me just deal with the first part of your question. Listen to Chris. I don't know whether he meant to or not, but it implied that in big facility development, somehow you're leaving out local communities as part of that. To which I would say, I mean, I don't know if you intended to imply that, Chris, but it clearly can't be true. Because in the world of Canada in this century, the 21st century, we know that they have to be engaged, they have to be part of it, they have to be equity owners, they have to be business and employment beneficiaries, and they have to be part of the planning process, which is one of the reasons why when I talk about what we need to be doing to get ahead of this, assuming the pace of change for 2050, and I think that's one of the basic things that we're talking about here. Assuming that pace of change, we're going to need to get better systems for consultation, cooperation, engagement, and involvement of local communities of all sorts. That isn't saying that there won't be big systems that have to be part of the solution.
Yeah, Mike, I mean, you talked about consultation, engagement. No, I'm talking about ownership and leadership.
I agree with that.
So let's use those words first.
I did say equity ownership.
And leadership is key on this. And so the question there is what I pointed out in this space was the issue of involvement and participative decision making. So it's not the old energy colonialism coming down and saying, here's what we want to do. It's First Nations and Métis and Inuit communities being directly at the table from day one. And that's when we'll go forward. And that's why things like Henvey and Lytton, that's why hundreds of projects have gone forward. It's a new way of thinking.
And I agree, and leave aside the idea of colonialism, which I think is kind of silly in a way at this point in the 21st century. We're not in that world. We're in a world of you have those other communities involved as part of the leadership. No question about that. That's not saying that you won't be building big facilities, at least some big facilities.
So Shannon, certainly the oil and gas sector and CAP has run into concerns on, and it tends to be, and it's also true not just in the oil and gas sector, but with transmission as well, that the challenges tend to be on the great linear projects where you have to deal not with a handful or a score of First Nations, but hundreds. So the question to you: how does your industry ensure that the rights are fully protected and the Indigenous people are full partners?
So, if you look at a project like the Trans Mountain Pipeline, you had a situation where over 120 communities along that pipeline route were supportive of the project, and about 6 communities were not supportive of the project, and now the project has been stalled for a long time. So I think we always need to be careful when we talk about Indigenous communities, that there's not one Indigenous perspective. There's lots of communities, lots of needs. Those communities are always engaged as early as possible before anything is done. And you're not always going to get consensus. And even though, and we can lose sight of the level of agreement sometimes on these projects. Going forward, what's really exciting in our sector is how many communities are interested in taking ownership of projects. Project Reconciliation is a great project. The Iron Coalition is another great project where Indigenous communities want to own things. Suncor has a partnership with a community in Quebec, with the Korean Quebec, to own assets. And so I think more and more, as part of economic reconciliation, prioritizing that partnership and creating opportunities for prosperity is possible. And these projects generate a lot of wealth for these communities, and that empowers them to pursue language preservation, community programs for their youth and elders. It creates new kinds of choices, which also I don't think get created in the same way by smaller projects. So, I think I've answered your question.
Okay. On the other side here, do you acknowledge that the go big approach, the large projects can address those concerns of the Indigenous communities across the country in terms of economic development and partnership and environmental protection?
Maybe. But the question I'd pose to Shannon is that what I think the hydrocarbon sector needs to look at differently is how, in fact, they do that. I think your references to some of the TMX initiatives are interesting. Let me give you an example, and I'm curious about your reaction. So you look at the LNG pipelines in northern BC to the coast. What about if we try to make green LNG by making sure the compression of natural gas is done with renewable energy owned by Indigenous communities? It may cost more, but when I put that to Christy Clark and Rich Coleman when they were in office in BC 7 years ago, they said, no, that's not a good idea. We haven't built a pipeline yet. I think the real issue for the big agenda is to do big differently, so big, in fact, becomes small because of the nature involvement for that part of the energy economy. So what I'd like to see is the energy sector and the hydrocarbon sector look at doing projects differently in a dramatically different way.
Well, your definition of doing differently might be different from others, but if you look at LNG Canada, the Coastal GasLink pipeline, that's another project where there was a high level of acceptance from all the communities along that pipeline. Crystal Smith, who's the leader of the HISLA, is out there talking about how different this project was, the kinds of opportunities it created for her community. And so it's different enough, and it's a stepping stone for other kinds of things, maybe like the project you've described. I think, it'll cost more is not something you can brush off when it comes to these projects. Costs matter, and you gave a reference earlier to Iran and unrest there. The reason COP is in Madrid today is because Chile was having major unrest, Bolivia was having similar unrest because of policies that led to the price of transit going up significantly and other energy in Chile going up significantly. And people can sometimes find being a prosumer interesting, but most of the time people don't want to think about energy. And when they do, it's usually because of something that has made their lives more difficult. And so you can never say, yeah, who cares if the cost goes up?
No, the difference though is where you benefit from the cost going up. If in fact the costs go up, but you're also benefiting because you have some of that gain. My classic example is of two farmers near each other with a wind turbine in between, owned on one farmer's land. One farmer has no problem with that wind turbine because they're getting an economic rent from it. One has a big problem with it because they don't. Mm-hmm. So the issue is, in fact, how you participate in that economy. The reality is that rates are too low. Electricity rates have to go up. They're much too low. We're not funding the infrastructure that we need, including the smart infrastructure for decentralized energy generation. In order to do that, you want people in the economy participating. It's a new form of energy capitalism that we need, not a perpetuation of the old.
Can I just respond one more time?
Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, well, I just want to say that energy needs to be more expensive is something that's said by someone who finds energy affordable now, and it's not a big part of their income. For lots of people, that is unthinkable. And participation in the economy or having opportunities isn't just about people participating in the energy economy. When energy gets too expensive, businesses leave, and people who would have gotten to participate in the economy or manufacturing near their home or other activities near their home, like natural resource development, don't get those opportunities anymore. So energy and participation in the economy isn't just about energy. It's about everything energy enables. When it gets expensive, it also takes away opportunity.
All right, I'm going to move on another question, if I could, because we have it's a big topic, and I think we need to explore some of the other elements to it. And we've had a number of mentions of the fact that negotiators are gathering in Madrid as we speak this morning Last week, the UN Environment Program released its emissions gap report that noted that the gap, in fact, continues to grow between the actions that have been promised by governments and what is actually needed to hold the temperature increases to 2 degrees, let alone 1.5. And those 2 degrees and 1.5 degree are numbers, but what they imply is massive dislocation to the global economy and the Canadian economy. So let's talk about that. How does the go home scenario, how does the go big scenario fit into that climate imperative? Shannon, you talked a little bit about that, but let's unpack it a little bit. How does your scenario fit into that imperative, and how does your opponent's scenario leave us short on it?
So how does it contribute? Well, the IEA just had a report on the future of global energy, and they have lots of different scenarios, but in all of those scenarios, people are still using fossil fuels for about 50% of their energy needs. And that's because of the need for energy around those human needs and around affordability. But yes, in a climate scenario, it's like, well, what can we do to change the emissions profile of that? As I said earlier, Canadian LNG, which is the lowest emission in the world, can cut in half one of the most significant sources of emissions growth in the world, which is the use of coal, which we're all trying to get off of, but what are we going to get off of it with? We still need deployable energy that can be available when it's needed. So I think that's a big part of how at least the energy my members produce can be a part of it. And the technologies that we've developed to control methane and other things, which aren't used anywhere in the world. If other countries that produce oil used Canadian environmental standards, global emissions per barrel would drop 20% today. Canada's going 45% below that on methane, and it's going further. And so there's a lot that Canada can do to improve the emissions profile of this industry and ensure that wealth is still created, which enables resilience to climate as we're developing the new technology and systems that we'll need to deal with this global challenge.
On the other side, Tanya?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to weigh in with the point that I made earlier, and we're sort of talking about this continuing growth in supply and this need for continuing growth in supply, and I won't argue that that won't happen, but we are also forgetting about, as the International Energy Association coined, the very first fuel, which is the efficiency opportunity. And so we absolutely have to look at that as the very first thing we do. And in the international stage, Canada has a huge opportunity right now to actually be leaders in how we can be very efficient about how we use our energy at home. So yes, we do want to make sure that we can get our products to market, because our products are some of the best, most environmentally sound products that should be in the international markets. But we also have a leadership responsibility at home. We are a resource-based economy. We need to show the world how a resource-based economy can be very efficient about how it actually uses its energy, and that starts at home.
So let's be clear then, what we're talking about here in terms of Canada has commitments not only to meet a Paris target, which was 30% below 2005 levels by 2030, but we're now talking about doing better than that, exceeding that in the short term, by 2030, and putting our, as the Liberals promised in the election, and it's now part of, I guess, federal policy, put us on a track to be net zero carbon by 2050. Is that something that the Go Big side thinks that Canada can achieve, or is that something that we have to look at in the global context rather than Canada meeting these national targets that have been laid out? Sure.
2 time horizons. I mean, one, remember that it's almost become a Canadian national sport to make commitments on greenhouse gas reduction and then not come anywhere close to meeting them. I'm not suggesting that we adopt that as our national sport, but let's put 2030 in perspective. The likelihood of beating that 30%, or even meeting 30% by 2030, I would estimate to be about 0. must we do a whole bunch of things to get the system moving in the right direction between now and then? I would say yes, and there is real urgency attached to that, including putting the systems in place to get us there. And that can include small, go home as well as go big systems. But the important thing is getting those systems in place and then aiming at a realistic goal for 2050, which is when it's really going to matter. There is an argument, and I would stand by this argument, that an excessive focus on trying to do it all by 2030, or doing a lot by 2030, will prove to be a distraction, which will potentially end up with consumer backlash and actually set us back.
But Mike, I mean, how do you square that fact with the scientific fact of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has said that we need to arrest greenhouse gas growth in about a 10-year timeline if we're going to keep the planet to maybe even 2 degrees, which I think 1.5 is done. In that regard, I actually think that I don't mind paying a couple more bucks for a tank of gas or electrifying my car, which is electric, with electrifying with a couple more bucks to save the planet. I actually think that it's a fallacy to say that we may not reach the targets that we have, but do we have to move faster? And I take your point that energy system change goes beyond the year 2030, but we have to accelerate much faster than we are currently, where we're going at. And part of that will involve more cost. And maybe the carbon price does need to go to $200 a ton. The reality is that we don't have 2030 or 2050. We got to move forward sooner.
Can I agree with you? At least up to a point.
No, that's not allowed in a
We need to be thinking about the willingness to take on extra costs. No question about that. We do need to accelerate what we're doing, and we have to be honest with Canadians. I've been involved with energy and climate policy now for 3 decades, and we have consistently, and you've seen it in the most recent electoral campaign, we have consistently said to Canadians, don't worry, be happy, we can do this without extra costs. Let's get past that and talk about, okay, what can we absorb? How do we offset those costs when they're unsustainable, either for export-oriented industries or for people who lack the resources? But we've got to talk about cost.
Sean, Mike's making a lot more sense.
I want to weigh in as well on that point because unfortunately I'm in agreement, but what I would say is that we actually need to, if we're going to make progress, we have to start talking about what actually matters to Canadians. And what matters to Canadians is very different depending on where your house is, where you sit, where you live. I gave Bridgewater example earlier today, their biggest issue is that I believe it's 70% of their population base is below the poverty line when it comes to energy, right? So they are living in a state of energy poverty. That is their biggest issue. In speaking to Canadians, you have to talk to Canadians about what matters to them. In that community, it's about energy poverty and removing that as a barrier. In other communities, it's going to be a different issue. And so this is, again, why it's so critically important that we start from home. We have to start with what matters in the local communities to local Canadians, find solutions that are going to be able to mitigate against those main issues that they have. And in many places, it's not about energy. But ultimately, it is about energy because they use it in their day-to-day lives.
So I'm going to come back to you, Shannon, on the issue of national targets. You know, the industry that you're part of has emphasized the need for providing hydrocarbon that would be cleaner than the national or the international average, and shipping it to places where it might actually reduce emissions in foreign countries. Where does that leave Canada's effort to meet targets? Is your organization, for example, supportive of meeting that target and doing it in ways that are laid out according to the treaty that we've signed and ratified?
So one of the most important things that's actually going to be decided at this meeting in COP are the terms of something called Article 6, which enable the trading of emissions credits between countries for reductions in GHG emissions that are generated in those countries. And Canada has used emissions trading, the Western Climate is a great example of that, to have a management of costs associated with emission reductions. So when I talk about that LNG opportunity, so displacing significant emissions in Asia by providing our LNG, that can be a source of credit generation for Canada that can help us to get towards our goals on climate, even as we continue to improve our technology and performance, et cetera, at home. And it is a feasible thing to be done in the 2030 timeline. So that would be my answer there.
And just by way of background from what I've heard around the COP, the likelihood of getting agreement on Article 6 in Madrid is not high. Not to say it won't get done, but there's a lot of opposition, and Brazil is leading it. And the absence of an Article 6 not only affects the kind of things that Shannon is talking about, but also whether Canada can account for credits that are purchased under the Western Climate Initiative.
Right.
You need an agreement between the U.S. and Canada in order to do that. So big issues there. Let's move on to some of the other issues that we need to peel away here. And one of them is financing, and capital markets have traditionally been kind to the go big infrastructure developers, although at times we've needed government guarantees to get there. And there's now increasing focus in capital markets on the risk and opportunities posed by climate change. So for the go home side, you know, how can you assure us, I guess, that that the capital that's required to build out this system from really the ground up is going to be available and will you know, the pension funds and insurance funds that control so much of our savings are going to be able to be brought to bear on this?
You know, Sean, having done several dozen clean energy projects, advising Indigenous communities, we've never had a problem raising capital. There is a challenge with the regulatory environment, the procurement environment, and the pre-feasibility work to get a project built. But financing the project to be built, there's never been a better time to do it. The cost of capital is incredibly low globally. And so the issue of capital being a challenge to the new energy infrastructure is a fallacy. The issue is that you do need good projects. And you know, Joseph Schumacher wrote a book I have some credence with called Small is Beautiful. And small isn't always beautiful. You need the key thing with a small project, a big project, is a good project. It's a good project that has the kind of economic yield that works. But the reality is for the small projects that are being done out there and for the medium and large ones, capital is not an obstacle. It's actually the regulatory environment, the policy environment, the procurement environment that are the bigger obstacles. You clarify that, you get it done. If we actually get a regulatory Canada building code at the nth degree, Tanya, wouldn't that drive more capital into the housing sector when builders and retrofits have to build it to that standard? Capital is not the issue. It's the will to get at the projects that's the issue.
Do you agree with that, particularly in terms of the scale of build-up that we're talking would be required?
I would go so far as to say that risk and associated with capital availability is probably the biggest barrier associated with the go big side of things, and for many of the reasons that Chris just cited. And it's political risk as much as anything else. It's also technological risk, depending on how far things and how fast things evolve. When projects we're talking about now in the power sector are 10 to 15 years from initial planning to operation. Yep. It's a very, very different world. I remember when I was with Canadian Electricity Association one time asking, and I won't tell you who it was, but it was a senior executive from a power corporation. I asked him to explain something about the economics of big hydro projects. Well, the answer I got was that nobody knows because they didn't worry about the economics of big hydro projects very much in those days. They just built them using provincial funds. It's a different world today, and definitely have to take that into account as we think about where the balance is.
So one of the factors for the hydrocarbon sector is this concern about big institutions that are starting to demand disclosure and risk analysis and so on. Is that playing into the financing and the capital market inclination to invest in big hydrocarbon projects?
Well, Canada is ranked #1 in the world on environmental performance according to the Yale Environmental Performance Index of 2019. So I think in the capital markets, our industry has faced what I think is unfair attack on our ESG record. We are leaders in environmental and social and governance responsibility in the world. And you know, if capital is leaving Canada, it's going to oil production in the United States that doesn't have the same standards as ours. And so I think it's incumbent upon us also to tell our story. But I want to just pick up from your last question around capital when it comes to go home or smaller or whatever we want to call it systems. And there's the capital to build those systems, but then there's the operating costs of systems that have a lot of variability, that are distributed, and that have to interact with larger systems to back them up. And those operating costs can be important, and they're part of why it's important to get these projects right, because they have that end user important impact. So I just wanted to add that in as well.
Okay, thanks. I think we have time for one more sort of broad question, and then we're going to move into closing comments. But a number of you have talked about policy requirements and levers. So let's talk about policy and what are the policy barriers to achieving your opponent's view? What are the policy levers to achieving your view? And I'm going to start with you, Tonya.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. I think there's a number of challenges. Where to start? I would certainly say that it's already been articulated that the sort of regulatory system that we have before us right now is a system that has served us well, we'll say, for many, many years. It comes with many benefits, you know, in the sort of the safety and affordability and all those elements that comes with regulation, but it certainly is not a space for innovation. And so we need to create an environment where we are leveraging the benefits that come from regulation, but allow for innovative solutions to get a foothold in the market, for us to potentially try them, fail fast, and move on. And we also need to create an environment that, from a policy perspective, that is not prescriptive in how these policies are established. They need to be principled, so that as new technologies come to the foray, when we've got lots of investment going on in new technologies, that those policies stand the test of time, and they don't need to be evolved every time a new technology comes into play. So how do we create, and this is maybe the devil in the details, but we need to create a policy environment that is principled versus prescriptive.
Can that be done in order to facilitate the kind of build out that the Go Home side is talking about? And then we'll talk about what your side needs.
There's no reason why not, at least in principle, because we know, I mean, I think there'd be pretty broad consensus around a lot of the basic principles that should be guiding this, but it's not part of the broader public discourse. It's not part of the political discourse, and honestly, there's stuff that the media could do to facilitate that. So yes, that's possible, and the big barrier, different perspective from what Tonya describes, which is the downstream regulatory system, but the big barrier, I would argue, is where we've got to with our regulatory systems and what that does to add all sorts of risk, including political risk, and we've got to rethink that and think about what it is we actually need to get done right across the spectrum, and how we get timelines that are consistent with what we're talking about for mid-century.
Mm-hmm. And I'd add, I think the other thing the Go Home side needs to be successful is just opportunities to pilot and see, you know, what's important to success in a given context, since these are going to be about going home and different opportunities going home. So performance-based regulations, but also opportunities for testing so that you can scale.
So we just did a rethink of our regulatory system. It was called Bill C-69, and it caused, you might have heard about it, caused some people to voice their concerns. So how did we get that right or wrong? And you know, I'm not sure there's going to be a great appetite to revisit it, although the government has said they'll look at how to implement it. Quite sure what that means. But you know, they took a run at it, and I guess from what I hear from you, and I'll be interested in your view, did they get it right or wrong? We know what you think, I think, Shannon.
Yeah.
Don't assume.
To say. Don't
Okay.
Well, I mean, I'll let Shannon weigh in if she'd like, because I won't count myself a deep expert on this, except it does seem to me that one of the things that we haven't done is thought about the balancing of the different requirements of community engagement and involvement and time to think these things through versus the corresponding effects in terms of project timelines and appropriate and risks. And I don't think that's been very well thought through. I think we need to step back a little bit. And it's not just Bill C-69, it's regulatory systems across the board. It's going to be a balancing act. It's going to be trade-offs.
I mean, Bill 69 dealt with part of the energy system, but I think to the policy question that you noted, Sean, really, let's create policy that's building the 21st century energy infrastructure that we want. And that first has to get to the policy that drives the built infrastructure well and the transportation infrastructure. That's where the real changes are going to occur to this. And I find that, so Bill 69 has its flaws, and there'll always be tensions with project development in terms of the pros and cons of it on individual projects and writ large. But I just think that we've only dealt with part of the policy question with Bill 69. We haven't dealt with the real opportunities, which is to create an energy infrastructure that is less wasteful and more has that community ownership and community involvement. And that requires new policy innovation, which is yet to happen.
Okay, so we're going to move into the last round of closing statements. Rather than restating your opening statement, what we're hoping to get from you is what you heard from the other side that really you know, crystallized in your thinking a little bit. You know, it's a debate, so maybe in the negative, but not necessarily. And we're going to start with you, Chris.
Sean, I'm a man. I can change if I have to, I guess. So I will acknowledge that what we definitely need to maintain in this country, and in fact accentuate, is the quality of the energy infrastructure backbone that essentially is going to be large and big. But what we have to do is to fuse that with the ingenuity and the opportunity to drive ownership involvement on the part of Indigenous communities, on the part of individuals, and also from technology innovators. Don't let's bet one way. Betting one way means that if you lose the bet, you lose it all. I think we need to place multiple bets. And so to my mind is that where the go home and the go big opportunity comes together is let's go to big where it creates the energy backbone that allows for the innovation to occur for the energy transition that we need to have, and particularly in terms of climate. If we don't unleash the energy opportunities that go home, my fear is we will fail on the climate agenda and probably on the economic agenda. But I will acknowledge that we definitely need the large infrastructure backbone that allows us to innovate and go forward. Thank you.
All right. Mike.
Well, let me just start with something that one of my colleagues said near the beginning of this, which is that no path is inevitable. We really don't have a very good idea of how the system might unfold, whether with respect to technology or the abilities of the decision systems, or people and communities, all of whom will surprise us, no doubt, for both good and bad. We do know with some certainty that people will demand energy systems that are safe, reliable, secure, resilient, and affordable. That's pretty constant. And they will add to that, they have added to that, they want to see much reduced greenhouse gas emissions. We also know that failures on any of these dimensions, and we've seen them from time to time, will have harmful and potentially dramatic consequences of one sort or another. So what I would argue, I guess, to wrap it up, is that if we're prudent, we're not going to allow ourselves to be motivated by panic or by ideology or by vaguely founded guesses about the future, but rather by a realistic sense of how change comes about in a democratic society. What I'd like to see us do instead is to make better use of information and decision systems, watching carefully for critical signposts that begin to resolve the uncertainties one way or the other. And in the meantime, we need to make lots of small mistakes, and we need to learn from them and adapt as the future emerges.
Tanya?
Thanks. So I get to frame it up in a little bit differently. I think one of the things I heard at the outset was, we sort of started on the electricity side, but I think one of the things that's kind of come through this conversation is we focus a lot on electricity, but it's not just about electricity. In fact, electricity currently is a pretty small part of the energy mix. Obviously, front and center for me was safe, resilient, reliable, affordable, environmental performance. I think all of those things are critical in both scenarios, whether it's the go big scenario or the go home scenario. That the infrastructure backbone is critical to our success, and that we need to be leveraging that, coming back to my opening statement about using a different mix of fuels, technologies, capital equipment, and management methods. And the devil in the details is how one actually sort of blends those things together and comes out with a mix that's right for Canada. But to the point of that I was making at the front end, and I think has come through loud and clear here, is again, we have to start with the home. We have to start with how we actually use our energy and making sure that we're being most efficient with the use of energy first and foremost.
Very good. And Shannon.
So, if I think about what we said here today, we want to give people choices around energy. Yes, we want to be efficient with how we use energy. Yes, we want to increase participation in energy. Yes. But I think we need to know that energy participation is not going to look the same everywhere, and it doesn't have to look one way in the future. And what we need to do also is think about, yes, energy is about the uses at home and in the community, but it's also about business uses and the uses for major industry. And we can't lose sight of how the future energy mix we're building is going to respond to all of that. And I think to the extent it go home and go big systems interplay, we can do that while ensuring affordability and not going down a road where we need to subsidize, for example, home energy use by adding a global adjustment tax to business use. I think Canada needs to go after climate change, and I think it's been an important thing we've all agreed and talked about today. But I think it's important for us to go after the biggest emissions we can get in the world, and I would still posit that it's our LNG that can make that big difference on emissions globally. And domestically, I think we shouldn't presume solutions, and we need to look for performance. We need to look for principles, and work with the current market infrastructure to get the energy we need where it's needed, and to get it there while constantly improving environmental performance. So.
Very good, Shannon. Thanks very much. So that wraps it up. I want to thank the debaters for their presentations and their respectful exchanges. And now I want to ask you. So you've heard more than an hour of this, almost an hour and a half. I won't ask you which side you're on, but I will ask a show of hands if the last hour and a half has led you to consider more the one side than you had been when you came in, or more the other side than you had when you came in. So a show of hands for those who feel like they heard more and are thinking more about and maybe more open to the go-home side than they had been when they came in. Okay, and a show of hands for those who feel they heard things that they hadn't considered and are considering more the go-big side than they were when they came in the door. Okay, well, I'm not sure we got a full
tie, Sean.
It's a tie.
All right,
a tie.
that's what we thought.
And then there are those who abstain who are the majority. Monica.
Thank you so much, Sean. I don't know if folks were here, probably at this point it was